Welcome to Top Stories Hub. Today we've got a new story, a mystery you'll want to unravel. Just an assistant, why is she messing with the piano? Those sharp words cut deep, shaming Emma Thompson, a former piano virtuoso now quietly toiling as an ignored staffer. When the top student faints right before a crucial recital, they shove her onto the stage as a last-ditch stand-in. They figured they'd ridicule her, but the second her fingers grazed the keys, the whole room went still. That plain woman they brushed off? She was poised to give the most jaw-dropping performance they'd ever witness, unveiling secrets they'd hidden for years. This is the gripping tale of unfairness, revival, and sweet justice nobody saw coming. Hey, before we dig deeper, hit that subscribe button on our channel. We drop inspiring, heartfelt stories like this daily. Also, leave a comment to tell us where you're tuning in from. Thanks a ton. Now, let's jump back into the story. What's the assistant doing touching the sheet music? The question pierced the hushed hallway like a jarring chord, halting Sarah Johnson in her tracks. Her hand lingered just above a tattered pile of scores, lists work scribbled with pencil marks, red ink, and a smug air of superiority. She stayed silent, she didn't need to speak. The voice came from Professor Michael Carter, a seasoned music theory teacher, once a wunderkind, now a staunch defender of old-school ways. He stood at Studio 3's doorway, gripping his trusty coffee mug, his face twisted in the same grumpy frown he saved for tardy papers and bold ideas. Sarah slowly pulled her hand back, eyes dropping. "Just sorting things, sir. Dr. Davis told me to arrange them by composer." "By composer?" he scoffed, his laugh laced with sarcasm. "Davis wanted them chronological. No wonder our recitals are a mess these days." Before she could set him straight, he was already shuffling off, grumbling about slipping standards and the folly of hiring outsiders for a music school. Sarah kept quiet. She always did. For 6 weeks, Sarah Johnson had drifted like a ghost through the grand stone halls of Preston Academy for the Arts, a place so steeped in prestige that even its rehearsal rooms had waitlists. Students donned black concert attire like battle gear, while professors basked in their glowing reviews. But Sarah, in her simple navy sweater and plain gray shoes, stayed invisible. That's how she preferred it. The last time Sarah Johnson was truly noticed, the price had been almost too much to bear. Preston Conservatory was a temple of music, with tall windows casting golden light on grand pianos and corridors humming with dreams of greatness. Sarah's days flowed in a quiet rhythm, polishing keys, organizing concert programs, tidying shelves of orchestral scores. She glided like a soft tune through offices and practice rooms, her gentle alto voice never rising beyond what was needed when addressed. She didn't gripe about doing tasks outside her role. She didn't wince when students brushed her off with the careless arrogance of the talented youth. And when Dr. Elizabeth Davis, the conservatory's stern, brilliant head of keyboard studies, thrust a messy stack of scores at her with a curt, "Make this clear, Miss Johnson," Sarah just nodded, slipping the bundle under her arm as if it were her lifelong duty. Only one person ever seemed to see her as more than just helpful hands, Madame Clara Bennett, the Academy's eldest and most intimidating vocal coach. Sarah sensed it wasn't warmth driving that gaze, it was a gut feeling. That afternoon, Sarah was in the copy room, surrounded by the warm smell of ink and toner dust, when a voice boomed over the hall speakers, "Attention, staff, tomorrow's scholarship recital kicks off at 10 a.m. sharp. All programs must be finalized by 4 p.m. today." She checked the clock, 2:17 p.m. That left her 103 minutes to perfect the document deciding which young pianist would snag the Academy's prestigious full-ride grant, the Hamilton Prize, backed by a donor so influential his name was etched in marble by the main hall. Sarah worked fast, sifting through notes jotted in 3 languages. Red ink corrections, Madame Bennett's signature, spilled across pages, while obscure composer names mixed with Slavic symbols and shorthand only the snobbiest would claim to get. She let out a quiet sigh and started typing. "Miss Johnson." A sharp voice snapped from the doorway. It was Dr. Davis, in her usual dark gray suit, hair pulled into a tight bun, her heels clicking like a metronome. "The program still says Ethan Parker is playing Chopin Etudes. That switched 3 days ago. He's doing Liszt's take on Beethoven's Fifth." Sarah's fingers stilled. "I'll update it right away." Davis's eyes narrowed. "And don't bother sharing your thoughts on how tough the piece is this time. Your job is to sort, not analyze." "Got it." But Sarah had thoughts. Ethan Parker, Preston's star pupil, was only 17. Gifted, sure, but Liszt's version of Beethoven's Fifth was a monster, a wild tempest of a piece that demanded not just technical skill but a depth of feeling far beyond showy handwork. Sarah knew it well. She'd performed it not in a practice room or lecture hall, but on a stage in Berlin before 2,000 people. That was 5 years back, before the incident, the quiet, and the moment she vanished from the world she once dominated. Now she printed programs and buried her past. That evening, Sarah headed to Madame Bennett's studio with the revised materials. The door was slightly open, box partita number 2 floating out like a golden stream. "Come in," called a voice, rich and aged like fine wine. Sarah entered, offering the printed sheets. "Here's the program, madam." Bennett took them with a quick nod, eyes still on her desk. "Is this finally the right version?" "Yes, madam, with Ethan Parker's switch to the Liszt transcription included." At that, Bennett looked up. "You seem to know our music awfully well for someone without proper training." Sarah tilted her head slightly. "Just picking up what I hear around the halls." Bennett watched her, still as a cat. "Interesting. Most folks here just soak up the racket. You seem to catch the essence." Sarah stayed silent. Quiet was her shield. As she turned to go, her gaze drifted to the piano in the corner, its lid half raised. On the stand was a worn score, Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the same version she'd used on her European tour. Her fingers twitched. "Anything else, madam?" "No," Bennett's tone softened just a hair. "Tell me, Miss Johnson, have you ever played?" Sarah froze. That question was a minefield. She answered steadily. "Just fiddled with the keys here and there." Madame Bennett said nothing more, but her eyes followed Sarah's back long after the door shut. That night, Sarah lingered late. The conservatory was hushed, only the faint buzz of cleaning gear and the odd creak of old floors breaking the silence. She wandered into Recital Hall B, empty, lit by the soft glow of dim lights and floating dust. There, shining in the shadows, was the Steinway Model D. Sarah approached it like a weary traveler to a shrine. She didn't sit. She just laid her hand on its lid, eyes closed, feeling the pulse of a lost life humming under her touch. Then she turned, walked off, and faded back into Preston Academy's quiet halls. No cheers, no spotlight, just her footsteps echoing softly into the night. "You talk like you get this music, Miss Johnson." The words hit her mid-stride, sharp but not unkind, cutting through the air. Professor Michael Carter stood in the conservatory lounge's doorway, arms crossed over his worn sweater, the smell of stale coffee trailing him like a shadow. Sarah glanced up from the score she'd just neatened. She'd let herself linger for one reckless moment. Ethan Parker's original program sheet had been left on a side table, marked in red by Madame Bennett, edited by Dr. Davis, and nearly tossed out. Sarah had grabbed it, not to pore over, but to save it from the bin. Yet, as she scanned the noted phrases, the bold crescendos, the brutal fingering, her mind slipped back, to Paris, to Vienna, to roaring crowds and sore fingers draped in silk. Now Carter eyed her like she'd crossed a line. "I just know the composer a bit," she said cautiously. "Beethoven's melodies stick with you." He gave a grim chuckle. "Liszt's spin on Beethoven isn't for hobbyists. It's for the fierce. You'd need to be a beast at the keys to even try it." Sarah held her tongue. That was her training. Let others fill the quiet with their guesses. "Look," Carter went on, stepping nearer. "You're good at your job. No score's been lost since you got here. But don't act like you grasp what's in these pages. That's not your place." He walked off, leaving his words lingering like a sour note held too long. The morning of the Hamilton Scholarship Competition hit like a conductor's cue. Swift, clear, and bold. Preston Academy was alive with energy. The auditorium sparkled with flower displays and velvet ropes. Donors in sharp suits mingled, wine glasses in hand, while students darted backstage, their pulses racing faster than any metronome. Sarah wore her best dress, a simple navy blue with a plain belt, her hair braided neatly to keep her steady. Today, she was tasked with handing out programs, each stamped with the Hamilton Foundation's logo and the name of the Academy's brightest star, Ethan Parker. He was set to open with Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth. No big deal, right? Behind the scenes, Sarah Johnson watched students stride back and forth like trapped sparrows. One muttered a shaky tune to himself. Another whispered full cadenzas, her fingers dancing on an imaginary piano. In the corner, slumped with a vacant, haunted gaze, sat Ethan Parker. He barely resembled the confident kid from the posters. His face was pale, shoulders curled inward, hands quivering faintly in his lap. Sarah stepped closer, her movements soft and deliberate. "Mr. Parker?" He didn't stir. She crouched gently, shrinking herself to meet his fear. "Ethan," she murmured warmly. Mind if I take a look at your score? He lifted his head, eyes wide and unfocused, as if lost in a fog. She reached for the sheet music with care, and he didn't pull away. Turning to the second movement, she tapped a tricky passage. You always speed through this part, she said in a hushed tone. He blinked, startled. You've been paying attention? Sarah gave a small, encouraging smile. Hard not to when the music's got that kind of fire. I keep tripping up, he confessed, his voice breaking. The rhythm. It just slips out of my grasp. She nodded knowingly. You're focusing on your fingers, not the flow of the melody. Think of it like ocean waves, not a storm. Let it roll naturally. Ethan stared, like she'd just unlocked a secret. How do you figure that out? He whispered, awe creeping into his tone. Sarah paused, choosing her words. Something I caught Madame Bennett mentioning once. It wasn't true. Before he could press further, a sharp voice cut through the hall like a gong. Everyone to your places. Ethan, you're first. Dr. Elizabeth Davis's heels clicked rapidly. Her clipboard clutched tight, her eyes scanning the jittery students. Miss Johnson, she added without a glance. Keep the green room calm. We can't have interruptions. Sarah dipped her head and stepped back, though Ethan shot her a final, pleading look of gratitude before moving toward the stage. She wished she could do more, but she'd already risked too much. From a nearby room, Sarah tuned in through an old brass speaker. Dr. Davis's voice boomed over the intercom. Welcome to Preston Academy's annual Hamilton Scholarship Competition. A ripple of polite claps followed. Then quiet. Then the music began. Ethan had started. His opening chords rang out bold and assured. Sarah shut her eyes, not chasing the notes but feeling the pauses. The piece's breath, its push and pull. He'd listened to her advice, letting the music glide rather than clash. But by the second page, tension crept back in. The crescendo lost its spark. The shifts grew hesitant. Fear was bleeding into his playing. When it ended, his performance was solid, technically fine, but not breathtaking. At Preston Academy, solid was a sin. Soon after, Sarah carried a tray of water glasses to the judges' table and caught their hushed critiques. Too restrained, Dr. Davis remarked. Far too cautious, Professor Michael Carter grumbled, nursing his coffee. These kids don't get list. It's passion, not a checklist. Sarah kept moving, silent, unseen, until Professor Carter noticed her and grinned slyly. Well, look, it's our trusty Shadow, he said, loud enough to catch Davis's ear. So, Miss Johnson, what's your take on young Parker's performance? Sarah froze mid-step. Davis's gaze sharpened. Indeed, Miss Johnson, you seemed quite involved backstage. The jab was meant to shame her, but Sarah had spent years turning embarrassment into truth. I thought he played with beauty, she said carefully. But he hasn't tapped into the soul of the piece yet. Liszt didn't just copy Beethoven, he reimagined him. That demands more than technique. It calls for courage. The silence that followed was heavy like stone cracking. Davis's teacup paused midair. Carter gaped. Another judge arched a brow. I shouldn't have said anything, Sarah stammered, her cheeks warming. You're right, you shouldn't, Davis snapped. Get back to your tasks, Miss Johnson. Leave the critiques to the experts. Sarah nodded and slipped away, missing how Madame Clara Bennett, seated in the second row, tilted her head, eyeing her like a melody she almost recognized. Something had changed. What do you mean he can't go on? Dr. Elizabeth Davis's voice, usually cool and collected, broke like a fumbled conductor's wand. The green room, just moments ago a space of soft pep talks and restless pacing, had become a boiling pot of chaos. Students went quiet. Professors hovered. At the center, crumpled on a plush bench with his head bowed, was Ethan Parker. He was trembling, not from stage fright, but something rawer, deeper. My fingers, they're gone, he gasped, struggling for air. Numb. Totally numb. Sarah Johnson stood a few steps away, rooted to the spot. His ragged breaths sounded like someone gasping for life on solid ground. His face was ghostly, his arms dangling lifelessly. It's a panic attack, Madame Clara Bennett said, her tone grim but steady as she knelt beside him with unexpected tenderness. His body's fighting back. His breathing's too short and his hands are shutting down. Davis's face twisted with irritation. Not today, Ethan. Not now. Bennett spoke calmly, follow my lead. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold. Exhale. but his eyes stayed wide, lost in panic. Professor Carter shoved through a knot of stunned students, his voice climbing. We need a replacement. Anyone. We can't push this back again. Mr. Larson's out there, he flew from New York for this. Ethan was the only one prepped for list, Madam Bennett shot back. This isn't some piece you can just read on the fly. It's a battle. Davis spun to the assistant stage manager. Track down Thompson. Maybe he can stall with some Chopin. He's already performed, Dr. Davis, the assistant murmured. And Lee's a violinist, not a pianist. We're risking $2 million in scholarship funds, Carter hissed. The foundation expected Beethoven violist. Canceling means a financial blow the Academy can't take. Sarah watched the frenzy unfold, their voices colliding, egos sparking. But her focus stayed on Ethan. Then, without a second thought, she stepped forward, kneeling slowly beside him. Ethan, focus on me. His breaths came in jagged bursts. Inhale through your nose, for counts, Sarah whispered softly. Hold it. Now exhale, 8 counts, nice and slow. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder, gentle, not pushy, just there. Slowly, his tensed shoulders eased, though his hands still shook faintly. He's in no shape to perform, Madam Clara Bennett murmured, her voice low. Dr. Elizabeth Davis whipped her head toward Sarah. Miss Johnson, get some cold water. Now. Sarah didn't budge. I can step in, she said instead. A heavy silence dropped like a stage curtain. Dr. Davis blinked, stunned. Come again. Sarah stood, her voice soft but steady as a rock. I know the piece, Liszt's version of Beethoven's Fifth. I can play it. Professor Michael Carter let out a barking laugh. You? That's ridiculous. I'm serious, Professor. You're just the office assistant, Davis said, as if clarifying Sarah's own identity. This is Beethoven through Liszt. Performed for the entire Academy and its biggest donors. I know exactly what's at stake. Madam Bennett eyed her for a long moment. You claimed you had no formal training. I never said that, Sarah replied, her tone gentle but firm. You all assumed it. The room fell so quiet. It felt like a single note could echo forever. You can't possibly be entertaining this, Davis said, turning to Bennett. What other option do we have? Bennett shot back. The auditorium's packed. Donors are out there waiting. If she's bluffing, we're doomed. But if we do nothing, we scrap the show, and Preston faces public embarrassment. Carter threw his hands up. Are we out of our minds? Sarah stepped forward, calm as the heart of a hurricane. I don't need the score. What did you say? Davis snapped. I don't need the sheet music, Sarah said again. I know every bar, every nuance, every pulse of that piece by heart. Then show us, Carter growled, shoving the score into her hands. Prove it. Sing one measure. Sarah took the pages, shut her eyes and softly hummed, da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. It wasn't just the tune. It was the emotion, the phrasing, the subtle swells of feeling in her voice, so deeply felt it left them speechless. Bennett spoke first. I believe she's for real. Dr. Davis wavered. Murmurs from the main hall were growing louder. The crowd was getting antsy. The break had dragged on too long. She faced Sarah, her voice icy and low. If you make a fool of this institution, you're out the door instantly. Clear? Sarah held her gaze unflinching. Crystal clear. Carter thrust the score at her again. At least carry this so it looks like you're trying. Sarah gave a faint smile. I won't need it, but thanks. Backstage, the stage manager ticked down. 30 seconds. Dr. Davis turned, pasting on a polished smile, and stepped into the spotlight. Ladies and gentlemen, her voice boomed through the hall. Due to an unexpected issue, our scheduled performer, Mr. Ethan Parker, cannot continue. We are privileged to introduce a replacement, Miss Sarah Johnson, who will now perform Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The audience stirred, confusion spreading like ripples in a pond. Sarah who? Wasn't she passing out programs? Davis stepped back, and Sarah walked into the glare of the lights. She felt the weight of their stares, their skepticism, their doubt. But something else stirred too, a warmth blooming in her fingertips. It had been 5 years since her hands touched a concert grand. Now they quivered, not from nerves, but from a rekindling spark. She gave a slight bow, sat, and adjusted the bench with pinpoint care. Then, in a single held-breath moment, her hands found the keys. Her fingers settled into old, familiar grooves, etched deep in her muscle memory. She paused, not for claps or validation, but for the quiet to deepen just right. Then she began. From the first note, the room transformed. The sound wasn't the only change. The very atmosphere seemed to hum with wonder. Sarah Johnson struck the opening chords of Liszt's Beethoven's Fifth with such power, such precision, that the crowd leaned in as one. The piano didn't just sing, it thundered. Yet beneath the strength was something magnetic. Control. Not the stiff kind drilled by timid instructors, but the kind forged in the fires of survival. Her fingers danced like lightning, smooth, exact, earth-shaking. She didn't glance at the score. She didn't need to. This wasn't a performance. It was a communion, a rendering of the piece with heart, not flair. Every note told a tale. Every crescendo was a revelation. Every pause a judgment. In the front row, Dr. Elizabeth Davis sat rigid, her face blank, but her hands gripped the chair arms until her knuckles paled. Next to her, Professor Michael Carter gawked, as if physics itself had flipped. Across the aisle, Madame Clara Bennett leaned forward, her breath caught in a mix of awe and reverence. "She's not playing the piano," someone whispered from the fourth row. "She's mastering it." The crowd had stopped muttering. They were spellbound. Sarah's hands wove across the keys, channeling Liszt's wild genius into something profound, something only someone who'd shattered and rebuilt herself could craft. This wasn't just skill, though she had plenty. It was alchemy. Years of hurt poured into every soaring phrase, every tumbling arpeggio, every tremolo a pulse that refused to die. The middle section unfolded like dawn after a storm. Soft, yearning, victorious. In that delicate hush, one listener murmured to their neighbor, "That's not Sarah Johnson." Bennett breathed the name aloud. Emma Thompson. The name caught like a spark in dry grass. Emma Thompson. Not Sarah. Emma. The prodigy who vanished 5 years ago after a devastating collapse on a Vienna stage. The one whose hands were called broken. The one never meant to play again. The one who faded into silence until this moment. Sarah, no, Emma's performance surged toward its climax. The final movement, the most perilous, soared through the hall like a war cry. Her fingers moved with blazing speed, yet every note landed true. Her body swayed, not with effort, but with intent, like a hawk rediscovering its wings. She could sense the audience sinking with her breath, no longer judging, no longer doubting, just watching in awe. When the last chord slammed into the hall, heavy with fate, the room froze. 3 seconds of utter stillness. Then a standing ovation crashed like a wave. People sprang up, clapping like a summer downpour. Davis remained seated, dazed, blinking as if emerging from a deep dive. Carter's program had slipped to the floor, unnoticed. Madame Bennett was already on her feet, tears glinting. Her hands pressed to her heart as she applauded. Sarah lingered at the piano a moment longer, hands in her lap, eyes shut, her spirit reignited. She rose, bowed once, and the cheers grew louder. From backstage, Ethan Parker peeked out, eyes wide, his panic attack a distant memory, replaced by sheer wonder. Emma turned to him with a subtle smile. He grinned back, thankful, grounded, transformed. She faced the crowd again, ready for another bow, when Dr. Davis stood suddenly. She approached the stage with mechanical poise, grabbed the microphone, and addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice shaky despite her polished demeanor, "we owe you some clarity." She turned slowly to Sarah. "Would you like to introduce yourself fully, Miss Johnson, or shall I say Miss Thompson?" The crowd gasped, murmurs swirling like dust in a gust. Sarah stepped forward, serene as still water. "I'm Emma Thompson," she said plainly. "This is my first public performance in 5 years." The audience roared again, not just with applause but with reverence. Whispers turned to exclamations. "Emma Thompson, the Vienna prodigy. I thought she was done for good. She's even more incredible now." A silver-haired man rose from the back. "Miss Thompson," he called, voice clear and strong. I'm William Larson. My foundation came to support the future of classical music. But today, we saw its rebirth. He smiled, eyes warm with respect. Would you do us the honor of teaching a master class for our students? Before Emma could respond, Dr. Davis cut in, her tone suddenly eager, her earlier scorn gone like morning fog. Preston Academy would be overjoyed to have Miss Thompson as our permanent artist in residence, she said, words tumbling out. We've long considered adding someone of her stature to our leadership. Emma raised an eyebrow but didn't call out the fib. The crowd chuckled, sensing the shift. At the stage's edge, Professor Carter cleared his throat awkwardly and stepped up. I owe you an apology, Miss Thompson, he said, his voice humbler than ever. I didn't see who you were. You didn't bother to look, she said kindly. That's not the same. She turned. Ethan was waiting. That was unlike anything I've ever heard, he whispered, eyes gleaming. You'll hear it again, she said, resting a hand on his shoulder. With the right mentor. Will you teach me? She smiled. It'd be my privilege. But one condition. Name it. Play for the music itself, she said. Not for their applause. He nodded, overcome. In that moment, as the faculty scrambled to align with her and the crowd hummed with shock and joy, Emma Thompson saw not a comeback to fame but the start of something greater, a life of guiding, mending, and helping others find their own melodies. A month later, a nameplate gleamed on the studio door, Emma Thompson, Artist in Residence, Preston Academy for the Arts. The door was rich mahogany, the letters gold, but Emma didn't care about the flash. She sat by a tall window, sunlight warming her cheek, a steaming mug of peppermint tea next to a pile of audition tapes and scholarship forms. For the first time in years, she felt what artists chase forever, a sense of home. The morning had been unreal. Dr. Davis now spoke to her with near-worshipful respect. Every faculty meeting kicked off with, "What's Miss Thompson's view?" Professor Carter, once a fortress of pride, now tapped on her door before speaking and avoided her gaze after a second. But Madam Bennett hadn't changed a bit. You were always Emma, she'd said with a casual shrug post-concert. You just let us think otherwise. A knock broke Emma's thoughts. She glanced at the clock, right on schedule. Come in. Ethan Parker stepped inside, sheet music tucked under his arm, a spark of cautious thrill in his eyes. Morning, Professor Thompson, he said, grinning. She smiled back. Let's hear what you've got. Ethan crossed to the baby grand in the corner, his posture relaxed, fingers sure now. He sat, took a breath, and played the Liszt passage that once crippled him. This time, the notes flowed like a clear stream. When he finished, he looked up. So, he asked, eyes bright. Emma tilted her head. Much better. You're not wrestling it anymore, you're expressing through it. He glowed with pride. Her voice grew reflective. But don't chase flawlessness. Music isn't about nailing every note. It's about honesty, even if your hands shake while you play. He nodded thoughtfully, then quieter. Do you ever wish you hadn't hidden who you were? Emma gazed out the window where a young cellist practiced in the morning light of the garden. No, she said. What I regret is that I felt I had to. After Ethan left, Emma stayed in her studio reflecting on how much had shifted in just 30 days. Letters from old colleagues flooded in. Where'd you go? Can we book you? Are you back on stage? But the spotlight didn't call her anymore. This room did students like Ethan and dismantling the narrow vision that once ruled this place. That afternoon, she was asked to speak to the new scholarship hopefuls. The recital hall was packed with faculty, donors, and eager students. William Larson sat near the front, his cane propped by his seat. Madam Bennett gave her a nod of encouragement as she took the stage. Emma faced the crowd with quiet confidence. I'm not here to talk about technique, she started. You've got instructors for that. I'm here to talk about perspective, not what you see in a mirror, a resume, or a piano, but what you see in others. She paused, letting it sink in. When I started here as an assistant, people figured I didn't fit in, that I couldn't possibly understand the music I handled or organized. My plain clothes and job title were enough for them to write me off. Her eyes swept the room, some shifted uncomfortably. We often only notice what we expect, she went on. And in doing so, we overlook the remarkable. She stepped closer to the stage's edge. Talent doesn't come with a label. Brilliance doesn't shout its arrival in the halls, and real power, it often slips into the room without a sound. The audience fell silent, hanging on her words. Ethan watched from the wings, nodding in quiet agreement. If I'd shown up in a fancy dress with a performance resume, you'd have hailed me as a star. but I came as an ordinary woman and that was all it took to make me unseen. She smiled, not with resentment, but with poise. I'm not unseen anymore. As Emma Thompson stepped off the stage, the crowd rose once more, not from duty but from something richer, admiration, acknowledgement, and, for many, a new spark of self-reflection. Outside the concert hall, a young violinist hurried up to her, eyes wide. I watched your performance video, she said, catching her breath. I've replayed it at least 10 times. Emma grinned softly. Time to set the phone aside and grab your bow then. The girl chuckled, then hesitated. Can I ask you something? Always. Why didn't you tell everyone who you really were from the start? Emma met her gaze, echoing the answer she'd given Madame Clara Bennett. Would they have seen me the same if they'd known? Back in her office, Emma tacked a note to her bulletin board. It came from a student she hadn't yet met, one of many now sending her daily messages. It read, I used to feel I wasn't enough because no one saw me. Now I think they just weren't hearing me. Emma shut her eyes for a moment. Music is sometimes about making yourself heard. Other times it's about truly listening. And often it's about finding the bravery to play even when the world isn't ready to hear your song. You're saying she overhauled the curriculum? Dr. Elizabeth Davis's voice, usually sharp and poised, trembled with barely hidden shock. She refined it, Madame Clara Bennett corrected, barely glancing up from her espresso. She spotted 6 mislabeled pieces in your Romantic-era syllabus and brought in 3 others ignored since the 80s. Looks like your take on history was a tad narrow. They sat in the faculty lounge, once a haven for smug academic jabs and veiled insults. Now it hummed with a nervous edge. Emma Thompson wasn't just back, she was reshaping everything. 3 weeks had passed since the performance that turned Preston Academy upside down. Quiet but profound changes began to spread through its polished marble corridors. Students once ignored were now given a voice. Sign-ups for Emma's master class had skyrocketed. Professors used to ruling without question now found their words measured against a new presence, one that held both weight and the crowd's ear. Dr. Davis, who once dismissed Sarah Johnson as mere help, now faced gentle but firm corrections at every turn. When she proposed dumbing down the winter repertoire for new students, Emma countered, if we're shaping them for greatness, we don't simplify the music, we elevate the guidance. Davis forced a smile, her jaw tight. Professor Michael Carter, meanwhile, was coming apart in subtler ways. It wasn't just his classes under scrutiny, it was his past. He kept replaying every time he'd brushed Sarah off, every eye roll when she offered to carry scores, every snicker at her mention of Liszt. Now students were quoting Emma. A second-year piano student put it bluntly in a seminar, Professor Thompson showed me how to hear the music. You just taught me how to avoid a scolding. Carter gave a stiff nod and slipped out. Emma wasn't after payback, though. She hardly seemed to notice the change. She just kept at it, meeting students daily, revamping the Academy's mentorship program, and starting a new Voices recital series to spotlight students who'd never had a chance to shine at Preston. Privately, though, she admitted it felt odd to be an insider again, odder still to be revered. The same halls where she once moved unseen now buzzed with her name, whispered like a myth. One day, while going over recital plans, she caught 2 young instructors murmuring, "Will she stay here for good?" No clue, but she's forcing us to rethink everything we thought we understood. That afternoon, Madame Bennett tapped lightly on Emma's office door and walked in. Your name's back on the European circuit, she said, setting a cream-colored envelope on the desk. Vienna's reaching out. Emma's breath caught. She knew the envelope's weight before opening it. Inside, in elegant gold script, was an invitation to Emma Thompson. We invite you to return to the Vienna Grand Hall as guest artist and judge for the International Virtuoso competition. 5 years after your last performance, we are ready if you are. She stared at it, lost in thought. Madame Bennett watched in silence, then said, almost offhand, you don't owe them a return. Emma looked up. Then why go? Bennett smiled faintly. For her, the you who walked off that stage in silence. Outside, autumn leaves fell like the gentle close of a nocturne. Inside Preston Academy, a quiet revolution rolled on, not with anger or spite, but with poise, honesty, and a woman stepping into her rightful place, not by demanding change, but by embodying it. The cool marble of Vienna's Grand Hall stood unchanged, same golden arches, same deep red velvet seats, same heavy hush before a show. But Emma Thompson was different. She stood at the rehearsal floor's edge, her eyes following the stage's curves, a stage she'd once fled, shattered, shamed, and erased. 5 years ago, her hands had failed her here. Tremor stole Liszt, Chopin, everything. Critics didn't just note her collapse, they feasted on it. Thompson falls in Vienna, a prodigy's ruin. Now they wanted her back. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan Parker glowed on the screen. You told me to play for the music, not the audience. Don't forget it. She smiled. He was why she'd agreed. The invitation wasn't just for a performance. It offered a seat on the jury for the International Virtuoso competition, a role of authority and influence. But Emma had one condition: she'd bring 2 Preston students, Ethan and a young violinist named Lily Chin, to perform on the very stage where she'd crumbled. That evening, during a rehearsal, Ethan approached her behind the curtain. His suit was sharp, but his fingers toyed nervously with his cuff. You don't seem fazed, he said. Emma let out a quiet laugh. Oh, I'm plenty nervous, but I've learned to keep it off the mic. He paused. Do you really want to be here? After what went down? She faced him squarely. I'm here for her, she said plainly. The girl who stood over there, she nodded to the stage's corner, thinking her value died when the clapping stopped. Ethan nodded, absorbing her words. I'm not here to win, she added. I'm here to free the part of me that stopped playing that night. The performance night arrived with grandeur and tension. Vienna's elite filled the concert hall with music leaders from across Europe in the front rows. Cameras lined every angle. When Ethan's name was called, polite claps gave way to silence. He strode onto the stage, shoulders square, hands open, just as Emma had coached. When he played, something remarkable unfolded. He didn't copy her style, he found his own. His Liszt transcription was vibrant, youthful, flawed in the best ways, alive with bravery, not caution. As he hit the final note, the hall let out a collective breath, and the applause wasn't polite, it was deafening. Backstage, Ethan half stumbled into Emma's arms. I pulled it off, he gasped. I didn't fall apart. No, she whispered. You became yourself. When her name was announced, it felt like a dream, not as a contestant or a spectacle, but as a master returning on her terms. She stepped onto the Vienna Grand Hall stage, no longer craving its approval. This time, she played not to prove anything, but to let go. Her fingers met the keys. The same Liszt transcription, but she played it not like a conqueror reclaiming glory. She played it like someone releasing a ghost. Each phrase was gratitude to the girl who endured, each chord a goodbye to the hurt. In the final movement, she glanced up. The chandelier hadn't changed, but her reflection in the Steinway's glossy black had. Gone was the broken prodigy. She saw a mentor, a creator, a woman who returned not to repeat history, but to reclaim what it had stolen. As the last notes drifted away, the audience stood again, some cheering, some in tears. But this time, Emma bowed not to them, she bowed to herself. 3 hours later, Emma Thompson stood alone on the balcony of Vienna's Grand Hall, gazing at the moonlit plaza below. Behind her, the party roared on, music insiders toasting with champagne, critics jotting fresh takes, professors murmuring her name as if it had never faded. But Emma wasn't there for accolades. She'd already felt the only ovation that mattered, her heart's steady rhythm. She'd faced the stage that once broke her and walked away whole. Why'd you really come back here? Ethan's voice was soft as he slipped onto the balcony beside Emma, his shirt's top button undone, fingers still jittery from the night's rush. I told you, Emma said, her tone warm but firm. I came for her. He raised a curious eyebrow. The girl I was, she went on. The one who left the stage 5 years ago, convinced she was worthless. I didn't return to prove I'm tougher now. I came to tell her she never had to feel shame. Ethan gazed out over the moonlit plaza. Think she got the message? Emma's smile was tender. I think she was out there playing with me tonight. The next morning, the competition results were pinned to the hall's brass bulletin board. Ethan didn't take first place, but he didn't need to. He earned second, with the jury showering him with praise for his bold interpretation and raw emotion. Lily Chun, the young violinist Emma brought along, won a special mentorship grant for her heart-wrenching performance of Saint-Saëns's Introduction and Rondo Capriccioso. Both had arrived in Vienna with no reputation or connections, yet left with their paths forever altered. That afternoon, Emma sat down with the competition director, a stiff man in a pristine tuxedo who'd once called her collapse a lesson in handling pressure. Now he was all warmth and flattery. Miss Thompson, he said, your students are remarkable. You've clearly discovered a new purpose. It wasn't something I sought, Emma replied. It found me when I stopped chasing what I'd lost. He coughed lightly. We'd be thrilled to offer you a permanent position here. Artistic director, lead instructor, a residency, whatever title you'd like, honestly. She paused, letting the offer hang. Then, I appreciate that, but I've already chosen a title that means something to me. He blinked, surprised. And what's that? Mentor. Back in Boston, Preston Academy was electric with her return. News of the Vienna performance had spread like wildfire, crashing the conservatory's email server with media requests. But Emma walked through those doors not with a star's swagger, but with a teacher's focus. She wasn't there for the cheers. She was there for the soft knock on her office door. A week later, a timid student named Mia Rodriguez stepped into her studio, clutching a tattered music notebook. "I don't feel like I fit here," she whispered. "Nobody hears me when I play." Emma nodded toward the piano. "Then let's make them hear something they can't turn away from." She wasn't there to reclaim her spotlight. She was there to hand it to others, to the quiet ones, the unseen ones, the assistants who held more music in their fingers than the titled ever realized. Sometimes, the best way to face your past is to become the guide you wish you'd had. The lights softened, the crowd fell silent, and in the heart of Preston Academy's Grand Hall, Emma Thompson stood before a packed audience of donors, faculty, alumni, and eager students. This time, no Steinway awaited her. Instead, 3 pianos stood ready, none for her. Behind them sat the first members of the New Voices Initiative, Preston's mentorship program spearheaded by Emma, a platform for talent that had been ignored, underestimated, or never invited. It was the semester's final night, and Emma wasn't the headliner. She was the connector. "I won't be playing tonight," she said, her voice resonating with warmth through the hall. A murmur of surprise swept through the crowd. "Instead," she motioned to the 3 students behind her. "They will." She stepped to the side, not back, just aside. Ethan Parker at the center, Lily Chan to the right, and Mia Rodriguez, a shy freshman who'd only started taking piano seriously 6 months ago, on the left. Ethan went first, delivering a reimagined Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, woven with a faint jazz pulse that lingered in the mind. It didn't defy tradition, it spoke to it. The audience sat, stunned. Next was Lily, her bow cutting through the quiet with Saint-Saëns again. This time rawer, less polished, but deeply honest. A melody that didn't beg for praise. It shared a truth. Then Mia. She shook as she approached the bench, but Emma stood just off stage, hand over her heart. Mia played Chopin's Prelude in E minor not flawlessly, but with a raw, aching realness. When she finished, the room held its breath for a long moment, stirred not by perfection but by depth. Then came the applause, loud, genuine, deserved. Backstage, the students burst into joy, embracing, laughing through tears. Emma stood back, her heart swelling with pride. Dr. Elizabeth Davis approached, her usual sharpness softened. She offered a hand. "Miss Thompson," she said, "thank you. I misjudged so much." Emma shook her hand, no trace of resentment. "We all miss things sometimes," she said. "What counts is how we act once we see." That night, Emma lingered in her studio. The concert posters were gone, the buzz about her comeback already fading from headlines, but a new nameplate sat on her desk. Emma Thompson, founder, New Voices Initiative, Preston Academy for the Arts. She smiled, not for the label, but for what it stood for. She'd once thought her greatest moment was on a stage, but now she knew better. It was in classrooms, practice rooms, in the quiet seconds when a student tackled a piece they thought was out of reach and gave it a shot. She scribbled a note and taped it to her door. "This stage isn't mine anymore. It's yours. Play with courage." Snow fell the morning Emma Thompson received the letter, sealed in a gold-trimmed envelope. No fanfare, no media, just her name, plain and unadorned. Emma. She opened it at her desk, sunlight glinting off the text as fresh snow draped the Preston courtyard. "Congratulations. The Preston Board of Trustees has unanimously greenlit your plan to expand the New Voices Initiative into a nationwide mentorship program. Your students have sparked inspiration. You've reshaped the future of music." Her hands shook slightly, not with fear, but with joy. She glanced out the window. Across the quad, Ethan Parker was coaching a younger student through a Mozart sonata. Lily Chun had just earned a spot in Juilliard's honors program. And Mia, in Studio 4, was writing her first original composition. something Emma hadn't dared at that age. The halls of Preston now echoed with the sound of potential, all sparked by a woman nobody noticed, who once just handed out programs. That afternoon, Preston Academy held its winter convocation. Faculty and students filled the grand recital hall, clad in black and silver. A massive banner hung above the stage. One note can change everything. Dr. Elizabeth Davis took the podium first, speaking not as a gatekeeper but as someone profoundly humbled. "We once taught music as a ladder," she confessed. "Now we teach it as a shared language, where every voice counts." She turned to Emma, seated among the students. And one woman started that change. Emma was called forward, not to play or judge, but to speak. She stepped onto the stage where her students now shone with confidence. Facing the crowd, she began. "I used to believe talent was what got you noticed," she said. "But I learned it's often others' assumptions that decide who gets heard." She paused, letting the words settle. "I wasn't always called professor or maestro or anything held in high regard. I was the woman in the background, holding a clipboard, the assistant told to stay in her lane. But talent doesn't need a badge, and genius doesn't always make a grand entrance." The room grew utterly still. She smiled. "Here's something to hold on to," she said. "The most remarkable people often seem the most ordinary at first. And when you choose to truly see them, you change the world." As she left the stage, every student stood, not from habit, but from love, from recognition, from truth. That evening, as twilight settled and candles flickered along the hallway walls, Emma returned to her studio one last time before the break. A small, unsigned envelope waited on her piano. Inside it read, "You didn't just come back to music. You brought us back to it, too." She sat at the bench, not to practice or prove anything, just to play for herself. For the young woman who once fled Vienna. For every student in every classroom who stays silent because no one hears. For every heart that mistook quiet for insignificance. The music floated into the corridor. Gentle, steady, powerful. Because Emma Thompson didn't just revive her career. She rebuilt the stage for others. She never sought the limelight or aimed to prove anyone wrong. But when they pushed a forgotten woman onto the stage, she didn't just play, she reshaped music's future. True power doesn't come from cheers. It comes from rising when no one thinks you belong. In that moment, Emma Thompson didn't just reclaim her past, she unleashed the greatness in others. The assistant they overlooked became the voice they could never silence. That's all for today's tale on Top Stories Hub. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me what you'd like to see next.